Walk with me, I'll walk with you. Down these troubled roads we've stumbled into. We're all in this thing together, we're gonna make it through. If you walk with me, I'll walk with you. Be there for me, I'll be there for you. When we're running out of hope, when we don't know what to do, like a candle in the darkness, shining bright and true. Be there for me, I'll be there for you. Oh, everything is gonna be alright. Everything is gonna be alright. Alright. 'Cause you and me got better days coming. Yeah, everything is gonna be alright. Walk with me, I'll walk with you. I know the rain of today will bring tomorrow's bloom, where we can't see where we're going, what the world is coming to. You walk with me, I'll walk with you. It'll be alright. Walk with me. Alright. Ooh, I will walk with you. Alright. Anything. Oh, walk with me. It'll be alright. Ooh, and I will walk with you. It's gonna be everything. It's gonna be alright. Everything. I will walk with. Gonna be alright. Ooh, gonna be alright. Everything. And I will walk with. Gonna be alright. I will walk with. Gonna be alright. Gonna be alright. Walk with me. I will walk with you.
Ooh, yeah. The sun is coming up again. Those winds of change are blowing in. I know, yes I know, feels like freedom. Been a long and lonely road, but I'm finally coming home. Oh, yeah, it feels like freedom. I am ready now, yes, I'm ready Those winds of change are blowing in, and I know, oh yeah, I know, it feels like freedom.
Walk with me, I'll walk with you. Down these troubled roads we've stumbled into. We're all in this thing together, we're gonna make it through. If you walk with me, I'll walk with you. Be there for me.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to our webinar space. So First Nations Australians make up approximately 2% of the Australian population, yet represent 28% of the national prison population. Sound familiar? Since the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody report in 1991 in Australia, incarceration rates for Indigenous Australians have doubled. Today, Indigenous men are 15 times more likely to go to prison than non-Indigenous men, and Indigenous women are 21 times more likely to go to prison than non-Indigenous women. Since 2011, the Torch program has been providing art and cultural and arts vocational support to Indigenous offenders and ex-offenders in Victoria, Australia, through its Indigenous Arts in Prisons program. The belief is that by embracing program participants as artists rather than offenders, the Torch provides an avenue for change. The reason I'm telling you all of that is that, as I said in the Zoom chat, as we logged in the Zoom chat, the slideshow that we just saw represents the Torch program's October 29th exhibition of artwork created by Indigenous men and women, both in prisons and post-release in Victoria, Australia. In response to COVID-19 restrictions on prison visiting, the Torch program invited their in-prison program participants to dream of a brighter future and to bring that future to life on standard 30 centimeter by 30 centimeter canvases. The exhibition is called Future Dreaming, Visions of the Future. And that's kind of our topic tonight. And so that's why we chose to show the slideshow. There were 122 participants across 14 correctional facilities that took part. And of those 122 artworks, 106 had already been sold as of yesterday. We will send out the link and I will post it on the Only Way Forward Facebook page as well, probably tomorrow morning. The playlist for the slideshow was created by Kira and I say playlist, but it was 2 songs. Walk With Me by Goldford was the first song, and that just started playing again towards the end. Goldford is an LA-based singer-songwriter whose lyrics are humanitarian and positive, and that's why we chose that for tonight. He wrote this song of hope in June 2020 while COVID quarantined in LA. The second song you heard is called Feels Like Freedom by Joanna Jones. She's an American actress-singer. Joanna did a stint on Broadway in the hit musical Hamilton in 2017-2018, and much of her music has been featured in the Grey's Anatomy soundtrack. Don't judge me for that, please. We are located on the traditional territory of the Wendat, Petun Nation, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. This land has been the site of human activity for over 15,000 years and is the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum, a sacred treaty between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabeg. The people online with us tonight are from all across Turtle Island, and we acknowledge and respect the people of this land. As many of you already know, my name is Nancy Russell, and I'm the program coordinator of the Criminal Justice Program at the Canadian Friends Service Committee, CFSC. CFSC was founded in 1931 and is the Peace and Social Justice Agency of Quakers in Canada. CFSC seeks to alleviate suffering and works to develop transformative and sustainable approaches to human rights, justice, and peace. We act through practical assistance, research, education, and policy dialogues. CFSC is a federally registered charity since 1967 and a not-for-profit corporation. I'm going to be very brief in my comments tonight. I can already hear the sighs of relief through the webinar space. We are fortunate tonight to have 4 speakers rather than the usual 3, and I want to leave ample time for the panel. So no criminal highlights or Canadian stats, no historic facts about the Religious Society of Friends, or no lists of famous Quakers tonight. If you're interested in learning more about CFSC and Quakers in Canada, though, I do invite you to visit our website, which Kira will post. She will post the link. Maybe she's doing it in chat right now. I don't know. Yes, she is. She's nodding. And she will email it to everyone after the presentations tonight. So tonight is the final of a series of 3 webinars that are part of phase 2 of The Only Way Forward, an initiative of CFSC. And you've heard some of this before, but as I said, I will be brief. Phase 1 of the project began in mid-September and consisted of a 30-day do the work calendar and a companion Facebook page. This phase of the project blended opportunities for self-reflection with online discussions, feedback, and the occasional Zoom film screening. The focus was on the justice system, colonialism, systemic racism, its impacts, alternatives, and possible next steps. We have been working with a very gifted advisory group of consultants since the early summer, and they have been influential in guiding the project. 2 members of the advisory group are also speakers on the panel tonight, Jennifer Grant and Monica Walters-Field. I'd like to introduce our guest speakers now. Jennifer Grant, if you want to wave, Jennifer, is a faculty member in the Child and Youth Care program at George Brown College. She is also, I guess your name is on the screen. You don't really, yeah, sorry. Anyway, she's a faculty member in the Child and Youth Care program at George Brown College. Jennifer is also a management consultant and coach in the areas of organizational change and equity work. Jennifer is the mother of 1 very talented daughter and also provides a home for 2 beloved pets, a cat and a dog. I've known Jennifer many years and was lucky enough to work with her at Central Toronto Youth Services and most recently at the Ontario Child Advocate. Jennifer is on the Only Way Forward Advisory Committee and has been involved with the project since the summer. We are delighted to have Jennifer here tonight. Christina Parker, my pleasure. Christina Parker, who will be joining us at around between 7:30 and 8, is currently an assistant professor of social development studies at the University of Waterloo. She conducts research on conflict dialogue, inclusion, restorative justice, and peace-building education in schools and communities. Christina is an attender at Toronto Monthly Meeting and the mother of 2 young children, which is why she's coming a little later tonight, bedtime. She is a published author and her work includes Who's In and Who's Out, Problematizing the Peacemaking Circle in Diverse Classrooms. So honored to have Christina with us tonight. Monica Walters-Field is a member of the Toronto Monthly Meeting of the Religious Society of Friends and is an associate member of CFSC with a focus on Indigenous human rights. She is also a crafts designer and an educator who has worked as a teacher, program leader, and craftswoman. Monica is a committed lifelong learner and served as an observer at the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues for 10 years with CFSC. Monica signs her emails with the phrase, "with hope and imagination," and this well describes the nature of her participation in all of her endeavors and undertakings. Monica has been part of the Only Way Forward advisory group since the start of the project. We are so pleased to have Monica with us tonight. Sara Tessier is our first speaker this evening and comes to us from the Coverdale Courtwork Society in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Sara is a social justice advocate with lived experience in the criminal justice system. She has spent the last 5 years working with and on behalf of some of the most marginalized, victimized, and institutionalized men, women, and youth in Canada. Sara worked on the JEC project, which was a collaboration of the John Howard Society, Elizabeth Fry Mainland Nova Scotia, and Coverdale Courtwork Society, hence the name JEC. It takes the first, I had to look for that. I had to search this afternoon. It took me a while to figure it out. And finally I found it. It's the first name of each agency that collaborated. That's what JEC stands for. Oh, and here's Christina. You just missed your introduction. Hi, welcome. So back to Sara. That project was supporting people exiting provincial jails during the COVID pandemic. And I'm sure Sara will talk to us about that. Sara is incredibly active and sits on numerous committees and advisory groups, including the Canadian Association of Elizabeth Fry Society's Lived Experience Committee. You will soon find Sara on the campus at Dalhousie University attending law school. It's an honor to have her with us and as our first speaker this evening. Sara has asked that we show a short video as introduction to her presentation. I think Kira's going to manage that for us.
In order for us to make a difference, we need to start working together. With United Way and the JEC program, we're able to put people in hotels. We can provide that support and that safety for them without judgment.
I've seen guys come out with nothing. My role is to bridge the gap between the correctional facility and community. Having a place to come to like JEC, where we are providing food, clothing, shelter, a whole host of other wraparound supports, it gives them something to build from. Nobody wants to walk through life alone, so it's important to have support.
I'm the only Indigenous peer support worker, so I connect Indigenous women to their traditions, their supports. Because of the pandemic, we've seen a lot more depression, loneliness. That's why with the JEC program, we had those one-on-one supports every day at the hotel. You need those traditions to heal, so I help them connect. We're all equal, every one of us.
Dignity and respect means everything. With the help of United Way, we're able to provide second chances. Everybody deserves a second chance.
Hi, I'd like to thank everyone for being here tonight. So with the JEC project, I'm going to talk about that because I think it was an important piece of alternative ways to reintegrate people back into the community without having to remain incarcerated during a pandemic. And unfortunately, since then, everything's gone backwards. But we were able to accommodate several people. I believe our numbers were 42 clients through the rapid release from the provincial prisons that didn't have places to go. They didn't have an address to call their own. And with the United Way support, the John Howard Society, Elizabeth Fry Society Mainland, and Coverdale Courtwork Society were able to provide emergency housing. Now, I'll be looking at some notes while we go by, so just bear with me. Nova Scotia has some of the highest remand rates in the country, with a 192% increase in the last decade. Over 2/3 of people in provincial jails are now on remand, meaning that they'll be awaiting trial and haven't even been convicted of a crime yet. The JEC project was put into place with the help of the United Way. Unfortunately, the province had cut funding for the community housing used to support the releases of the incarcerated people during the COVID-19 pandemic. The program was successfully allowed to release 41% of provincially incarcerated people during the pandemic. And looking at our numbers, the recidivism rate was 0, which is phenomenal. We were able to provide so many different supports to the people that were released into the community under our programs. So we're providing mental health supports, key workers, housing supports, peer support, whatever the clients needed. And we were able to house pretty much everybody in the program was either housed in a shelter, or we found them housing through the assistance of our housing support workers in the community and apartments. And, you know, they were able to keep their dignity throughout it all, and they were able to do it without being judged. We provided assistance with any addiction services they needed as well. Now, the cost to keep somebody incarcerated is around $271 a day in the province, and that's according to the 2017-2018 figures. The supported housing program cost around $125 a day. So we're looking at less than half the cost to keep somebody in the community through our program. And it's a proven model of success. Not only did we decrease the prison population, we're allowed to offer the supports in the community where it should be in the first place. And I would like to read a quote from the executive director of Coverdale Courtwork Society, Ashley Avery. And she says, it is very disappointing because now, just so you know, an update on this, the Justice has now decided that they're going to fund $150,000 into electronic monitoring, as opposed to a program like ours where we can house people in the community. Now, the problem with that, as everyone may be aware from what I was just saying, these people that need to be back out in the community that are sitting on remand a lot of time have no place to go, no fixed address. So how do you propose that you're going to monitor someone when they don't have a location to be monitored from? And Ashley Avery says, it is very disappointing that there have been no government funded responses to remand for women in the Halifax region, and that despite extensive research and recommendations from expert committees, the province is investing in electronic monitoring. Women and gender diverse folks experience punishment differently to men and have different and more complex needs in the community. This approach will not address these needs. In the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, plus a housing crisis, and without supportive housing for women seeking bail, we know that this investment will fall short of supporting the most vulnerable. We are talking about a population of women that are extraordinarily marginalized in our communities: Indigenous and Black women, women with mental health issues and substance use disorders, and who are vulnerable to violence, are precariously housed or homeless. The women that need the greatest resources will not be affected by e-monitoring, nor will this approach reduce the remand population in a meaningful way because it has not been proven to reduce recidivism. This approach is premised on someone having a fixed address during a housing crisis. It is inequitable, but also dangerous for women who could end up confined to an unsafe place in the community without support or resources. Now, we work with people, with women, we work with women, trans, non-binary, the 2S LGBTQIA++ community, and girls. We have a new Pathways program that's driven by our newest member of the team, Bria Simons, who's an amazing person and offers programming and supports to girls, trans, and non-binary youth that are at risk of becoming or are currently involved in the criminal justice system. We also have a lot of programming for the women, trans, non-binary folk who are in need of supports through trauma-based programming, addiction services, grief and loss. These are all the things that we provide within the community. We not only provide this through our organization, but we collaborate with other organizations to bring a more diverse and much needed sense of belonging and supports that couldn't be offered in just one place. What we need is community alternatives to prison, community alternatives to policing responses that are community-based, trauma-informed, and not punitive. Jack did amazing work, and all of that has been undone now by the Justice Department. And it's infuriating to know that something that we were called upon to put together on such short notice and scrambling to make everything happen, that was such a successful program, is now just being thrown aside for something that's proven not to work. People don't need to be put in prisons. People don't need to be sitting in jail. People need to be in the community where the resources need to be funded so that this does not become a problem that leads to incarceration and criminalization. It becomes a solution to the problems that are there in the first place that lead to these offense cycles. Now, another thing that we're currently working on as well is working on a alternative to criminalization within the youth. And right now, what happens is with restorative justice opportunities, with the domestic violence when it comes to children, and that's what they are, the youth are children, rather than criminalizing them, what we need to do is be providing alternatives to that, which is teaching them life skills, teaching them healthy relationships and boundaries and emotions management, all the things that is very common with youth when they're in first relationships. They don't understand the emotions they feel. They're not equipped to deal with first-time breakups, things like that. This isn't necessarily a cycle of violence at a young age. This is about inexperience and inability to cope with certain emotions that they haven't experienced before. What we need to do is provide an alternative to criminalization, and that's providing the supports and resources and programming and skills needed to assist these young people in learning the life skills needed, as opposed to criminalizing them and causing this to become a cycle that's brought into adulthood, which is what happens, is it continues on into adulthood, because that's, once they're criminalized, now you've put a stigma on them where it's very difficult for them to finish their education, to get jobs in the community, anything like that. And we need to break that cycle at a young age. And we also need to help people to become more comfortable with themselves and what they need to do to grow into adulthood. What we need to do is start coming together as a community. We talk about social justice, we talk about resources in the community and everything else. What we need to do is come together and start working together, collaborate, and this is how we're going to start making change and progress in the world. You can't change by trying to reform people in a prison. Prison system's broken. It's not a place where you go to find help with what you're lacking, your mental health needs, addiction services. That doesn't come out of prison. That comes from community supports, from love and collaboration within the community. If you have somebody going into a prison, what you're getting is more violence, more oppression, more discrimination, more, it's a violent place, it's a traumatic place. All you're doing is you're adding to the reasons why they're in there in the first place. And that's usually a lot of past trauma, which leads to addictions, which leads to a lack of emotional management, lack of anger management, these are all things that can be taken care of in the community, as opposed to creating more turmoil and more trauma for victims. And that's what they are, victims of trauma and violence and abuse and oppression. And that's where we need to come together and start working in the community to make a change. I don't know how much time I have left here, but I know that Elle Jones is one of my most favorite people in the world. She's a very dear friend of mine and a mentor. And she works hard every single day to do everything she can to bring awareness into the community. Talking about defunding the police, talking about making changes. And that doesn't come by just, reforming a broken system that's already there. It doesn't come by trying to fix something that can't be fixed. And people like Elle Jones, people like Ashley Avery, people like Emma Halpburn, these are all people in the community that fight hard every day that I look up to. Now, with myself, I do have lived experience. I went through the system. And the reason I'm so passionate about making changes because I've seen the injustices. I've seen how the system has failed people who are inside, people that come back out into the community. And I want to make changes so that other people can get to the place where I'm at now. I've come out, I've been working in the community, doing everything I can to support those who need, somebody that they can trust, somebody they can rely on, somebody that they can talk to. And it didn't come without a lot of hard work, but I did that work myself. It wasn't the criminal justice system. It wasn't the Correction Service Canada that made the changes for me. It was me. And I didn't do it without a fight, because I had to fight to get to where I am today. And I had to fight them. They're not there to reform you. They're there to oppress you. They're there to control you. And what I did was I fought back and I said, I need to make changes for myself and I need to move forward. So that's what I did. And it took a lot of hard work and it put a target on me. And in doing so, I was able to advocate for others. I was able to work on myself, focus on what I need to do to not only better my life, but those around me and those that are still stuck in that system and being criminalized and marginalized and oppressed. So now I've come a very long way. I just wrote my LSAT. I'll be starting law school at Dalhousie in September. And I'm out there making a difference. And that's what it's all about. I'm one person in the community trying to make a difference. The way we're going to be able to achieve that is by all working together. So ask yourself, what can you do to step up and be a part of change and be a part of making your community better? And that's about all I have for now. So I'd like to thank you all for your time and thank you for coming.
Thank you, Sara. I have questions for you, but I'll save them to the question period. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Jennifer Grant. Hi, Jennifer. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having and hosting this. I want to thank Kira and Nancy for hosting what is a amazing and important conversation. I think particularly in this moment in time, it's important for us to kind of really consider some of the things that have been shared throughout this process of the web series. I'm going to share my screen. I'm a PowerPoint kind of girl, so I'm going to share that and talk a little bit about a way forward. I mean, part of this conversation is looking at how we can move forward. And when I was thinking about this topic, I have to be honest, I was a little apprehensive because I do not come to this conversation as an expert in anti-policing or in prison abolition. I come with a specific perspective based on the work that I do. I'm, as Nancy mentioned, an educator a consultant and often in management positions, so often working within systems that are actually complicit or part of the problem. And so trying to figure out how I would bring that forward was really about thinking about that perspective and considering what would I have to offer to this conversation in terms of a way forward. One of the things that I thought I would start with is how I kind of see the problem. I think Sara did a really great job of kind of illustrating the concern that we have, where you have, sorry, that's my dog, where we have a situation between oppression and liberation. There's a chasm in between that, and we really want to figure out how we cross that chasm. You know, on one side we have, you know, a situation where there's injustice. I mean, you hear Sara talk about the consistent problematic situations that we have within the justice system, that we continue to create these regressive policies and practices that really more so than alleviate the problem, but entrench the problem and create a situation where we're not moving in the right direction. Yet on the other side, I think we all, particularly those on the call, are hoping that there is this space of liberation, that there is this hopeful space that we can get to. And when we think about a way forward, we're really looking at how do we cross that chasm. So much about what has been spoken about throughout these last couple of weeks has been about building that bridge. And so for me, I was thinking about what does that look like? And I know that all of us kind of believe in this transformational change, or we want to, right? And this idea that things can be different. And when I think about the change that I'd like to see, not only in policing, because sometimes I do think that, you know, when we look at one symptom of the problem, that we might be looking too small and that we need to broaden it out and think more transformationally and thinking about the whole system that often is set up to provide preferential treatment to those at the top of the ladder and certainly marginalize and give less access to those at the bottom. I think we need to be thinking about how do we create that change. I know throughout the conversation, there's been a lot of conversation about imagination and imagining a new space. I mean, the beginning of this webinar series, we had those wonderful, that gallery so much of art that looks at dreaming and thinking about something new. And I like to talk about imagination because I work with young people. Part of the world that I'm in is training young people to become, to work with other young people. And I've spent most of my career working with frontline young people or working on behalf of young people. And so imagination is in my wheelhouse, so to speak. It's helpful to be thinking about creativity. And I think it's necessary in this conversation. So much of the tools that folks have been talking about throughout this series has been about thinking and imagining and dreaming a new space. And I also like to think about the fact that the truth is that we've created this system through imagination. It wasn't great imagination and certainly wasn't positive, but you know, you have to have an imagination, if you think about it, to think that solving a problem would be rounding up people, disciplining people, surveilling people and holding them in cages. That takes quite an imagination. And so if we've created this system through imagination, I imagine that we could create something else. And so I wanted to think about that and what I would be able to contribute. But I had a pause, and part of it is that so much about this work, although necessary, seems impossible. And the thing about imagination is that it often, it stymies us, it stops us, because imagination seems scary. What's impossible seems unachievable. Sometimes the chasm looks so wide that it doesn't feel like we can jump from one side to the other, and that there isn't enough opportunities to build the bridge that's necessary. And so for me, I really want to think about practical yet revolutionary steps. And I love this quote from Billie Holiday, and it says, "The difficult I'll do right now, the possible might take a while." That helps me frame a practical solution. Times when we're looking at transformation, what we're asking for, how do we start? And we know that there's going to be a difficulty in starting, but if we only view it as an impossible start, it at times paralyzes us and stops us from moving forward. So through the lens that I have, which is an educator, a manager, a consultant, I thought about what is it about those roles that can contribute to this conversation about a way forward. And for me, what I found in all those roles is that the way that I've been able to solve problems, the way that I've been able to find solutions, the way that I've seen change and revolutionary and transformative change has been through relationships. So for me, I wanted to bring that forward. And Sara just spoke about the necessity of relationships. And I kind of also want to talk about the necessity of relationships and how I think that might be an opportunity for us to consider a way of change. I want to talk about it, however, in terms of a relational approach. In child and youth care work, we're often talking about a relational approach. The way to work with young people is not through punitive measures. It's not through discipline. It's often through creating these really profound, meaningful relationships in which one wants to then look at how they might change. It's the belief, it's the enduring belief that we are working alongside young people to see that change. And the only way we can work alongside them, the only way they'll invite us to be beside them is if we build relationships. So for us in child and youth care, often relationships are the transformation. That is the transformational work. And so for this conversation around policing and anti-policing, I think there is a way forward using that relational approach. I thought I would use some platitudes or truisms. Often when we think about relationship, it does sound quite simplistic. Often we're talking in ways, build community, build coalitions, build relationships. And I do think that there's a simplicity in that. And I actually think most change comes from simple ideas, but that we then need to do those simple ideas in meaningful ways. So I thought I'd start with these truisms that we hear all the time and then kind of go deeper and think about them as ways to potentially move forward. The first one is know thyself. Often we hear about that we need to be, we need to understand ourselves, we need to know ourselves, we need to start with ourselves. And I do think that's important. But for me, what that means to me is that it is essential that as we go and move forward in this work, or as we're thinking about ways to move forward, that we have a meeting with ourselves, that we truly meet ourselves in a clear, compassionate, and constructive way. And by that, I mean that there are times in conversation, particularly when we're going into social justice work, that we start without considering where we sit, what our worldview is, how our identity is affected by or connected to or part of the solution or problem. And I think we have to situate ourselves first. I think we need to think about who are we in relation to this issue? How is our understanding of self helping or hurting the issue? Often when I speak with folks around particularly anti-oppression work or anti-racist work, we're often kind of deconstructing our relationships to ourselves and our relationships of our identity in relation to how society sees us. And I think that's important because without that, what happens is that we have the potential to actually become part of the problem if we're not clear of our beliefs. If we're not clear on how our behaviors are either dismantling or upholding the system, we can become complicit. So much of the work that I do in CYC work is understanding that part of being a child and youth care worker is understanding that the for me to think about how I understand justice. It's important for me to understand how I think about punishment, crime, hope, redemption. These are things that I think one has to examine first within themselves before they move forward and think about change. So that takes a reassociation with self. It takes a opportunity to kind of join with yourself and do that first relationship building with who you are so that you can understand your relationship with the problem. The next truism I'm going to talk about is this is actually my Uncle Ben's truism. He used to say to me, this is an old Southern man. I grew up a little bit in Florida. Yay, Florida. And I spent a time with him and his family. And he was a pastor of a faith-based recovery church. And often when he was preaching, what he would say is, folks, in order for us to do good relationships, we have to do some good asking and good listening. He would go further and say, God gave you one mouth and two ears for a reason. Use them with capacity. I'm sure folks have heard that before. But for me, what that really spoke to was that relationships required a certain amount of curiosity, a commitment to that curiosity, and this kind of humble inquiry, this ability to kind of meet folks in a meaningful way. So not building relationships with intention, but building relationships with meaningfulness, right? That is below the intention. It also requires us to lead with listening. So rather than, again, creating environments where we're hearing people, but going into this deep listening and allowing ourselves to learn from others in ways that are often surprising because we're pausing for moments and we're taking the time to put aside our stuff and really seek solutions through what we're hearing from others. And I think this is necessary both in individual and interpersonal relationships, but also when we're looking at communities and specifically when we're working within systems. Again, I work in systems, right? I work in these spaces that are often intransigent or do not want to change, or like Titanics where you're trying to shift. And I don't think those shifts happen easily, and sometimes they don't happen at all. But ultimately, the only way they happen, in my experiences, is through a relational approach that includes asking good questions and listening well. I love the tool that Nancy and Kira shared with us, where it was the non-reformist reform versus abolition reform tool set that had in it some very important questions that allowed you to kind of dig deeper on the solutions that folks are suggesting for quote unquote reform. And that is an example to me of strategic questions, really questions that require us to dig deeper, questions that create motion, questions that allow for some solution finding and creative solution finding and innovation, and questions that don't kind of sit on this space of binary solutions or binary choices. I think we've kind of come into a space today in the greater zeitgeist where folks are really kind of an either or. And I think as we're building relationships, we're looking for change, we have to be a both and. I think we have to kind of build beyond these kind of really black and white solutions and moving into opportunities for change and creation. And then lastly, the last truism is action speaks louder than words. And again, it's an attitude that we hear over and over again. And for me, what it means is really the idea that a relational approach requires us to take action and to act out. I am someone who enjoys an opportunity every now to act out, to behave badly, because I do think that sometimes that's necessary to kind of move outside of the system and to push the system in new and sometimes disruptive ways. But I also understand that one has to do their something. And so when I say do your something, years ago, I would feel really guilty about not being the type who was often on the streets with placards protesting. It wasn't my thing. And so that there was guilt to that because I didn't know myself to recognize that that's not your thing. Where your justice, where your social justice work lies for you is education, right? You're an educator, right? And so I can be a social justice educator. That's my something. What is your something? I think when we're thinking about moving forward, very often we're kind of thinking about the way others move forward instead of the way that we can move forward and finding your something. I heard someone talk about being a social justice data analyst. Brilliant, right? The ability to look at data through the lens of social justice. Can you be a social justice chef? Can you be a social justice engineer? Can you be a social justice stay-at-home mom? What does it mean to promote, pursue, and create a way forward through the space that you're in and that gives you most passion? But included in that is an awareness of the outcomes that you want, the intended outcomes that are necessary. I think Miriam Kaba often talks about her intended outcomes in terms of prison abolition. When you understand and know where you're going, when things go off course, you can correct, right? And so I think it's important as we're doing our actions to know what our outcomes are, and also to know what our purpose is. It's always important for us to be aware of purpose, because again, that's what's going to give us energy. I do think that this work is hard at times. It's not always what gives you the place of energy because you're constantly pushing against something. But I think purpose gives you the opportunity to kind of always have a underground grounding energy that keeps you forward. Courage is something that I talk about in the work that I do, because I do think courage is necessary in change work. When you're building relationships, it takes courage to go out there and meet someone who may not be someone who you understand, someone who's new to you, someone who's different to you. It takes courage to call people out and call people in and to ask them to change their behavior. It takes courage to push against systems. And I think that is included in our actions. We need to act with courage. And then the last thing, and this is something that Sara just mentioned, and I thought it perfectly goes well, is to start now. Far too often, we are waiting until we have things perfect. Well, maybe I'll speak to myself. I'm often waiting for perfection. I like the idea of having a plan and being purposefully moving forward, knowing exactly what comes next. But I think this is messy work. And I think we have to divorce ourselves or disentangle ourselves from this idea of perfection. I think that idea causes us to not move, not risk, and not be courageous, and not actually do the things that, when cobbled together cumulatively, actually create change. So I'm going to end with just a summary of what I'm saying, and hopefully I think I was quick. When we're thinking about relationships and a relational approach, I'm suggesting that it's a catalyst in itself for change. I'm suggesting that when we look at that chasm, when we think about the different roads that might cross that chasm, that relationships become like a guardrail and allow us to build the necessary community and coalitions that work within or outside of the system. I'm suggesting that when we have good relationships with ourselves, that we are situated clearly in the process, and that provides grounding, perspective, awareness, but it also creates a humility within us and allows us then to have the necessary empathy to kind of build relationships outside of us. I'm also suggesting that in our approach to change, we need to be purposeful and outcome oriented, and not outcome oriented in a measurable way, but in a directional way, that we want to move in a certain direction and know that. And I say that because far too often, I think when we are working and unaware of where we're going, unconnected to our purpose and unconnected to an outcome, we can get fooled, right? And I think by understanding who we are and understanding our purpose and our direction, we are less likely to be fooled. And by fooled, I mean systems, and particularly systems of oppression, racist systems. They have by a system that is changing, not to meet our needs, but to meet its needs. So that's where I end this conversation. But I want to stop with or end with this quote from Miriam Kaba. And because I do think that regardless of what you choose in terms of your way forward, that you need to act with urgency, and that urgency needs to be held with the understanding that we are still going to seek change, and it may take a patience of 1,000 years, but that it's worth making that first effort to move forward. So that is all I have. I thank you all for listening to me, and I hope that at least it gives you a little something to think about in terms of how we might move forward.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. I have questions for you too, and we have questions that were submitted ahead of time that we'll get to after the next two speakers. Thank you. You have given me a lot to think about, and so is Sara. Christina Parker, it's your turn. Christina, you're on mute still.
Sorry about that.
There you are.
Yeah, yeah, okay. So I just start to share my screen. Yeah, thank you so much, Nancy and Kira, for all the work you're doing to bring us all together today. It was really wonderful to hear you, Sara, and hear you talk about all the work that you're doing. And I really feel like when you're talking about young people and the emotions that they're dealing with and how we can actually support young people with navigating those emotions, I hope to touch on a little bit of that today, as well as what you just spoke about, Jennifer, with relationality. When I'm coming to this work from researcher, educator perspective, and thinking about how we can actually work with schools and young people proactively when we're thinking about conflict, when we're thinking about dialogue, when we're thinking about ways in which to build peace in classrooms. And when we think about a society where you have citizens that are engaged and equipped with the tools to manage conflict, you really do have a society that can overcome and prevent global atrocities, bringing us closer together to a culture of peace and humanity. And I believe that through conscious communication, through dialogue, inclusion, and peacemaking, we really can enable peace building and cultural inclusion. So the research that I'm going to be presenting and talking about today in relation to the themes we're exploring focuses on how we can equip young people with the tools to really drive more engagement. So I've been working in schools in the Toronto area since 2006, either as a teacher or a researcher, and I really feel privileged to have had the experience of conducting research in a variety of different schools in different neighborhoods. And today I'm going to share some of those findings and learnings of studies that I've conducted that specifically focused on dialogue, inclusion, and peacemaking, looking at an ethnography with elementary students specifically, and looking at how teachers are being trained in restorative justice to facilitate peace circles in schools that are considered high priority in Toronto. And a lot of this work has been done with my mentor and colleague, Dr. Kathy Bickmore from OISE, who I also had the privilege of working with. So to situate my work here, I just wanted to share some widely accepted premises of conflict and dialogue for peace building and social justice. So first, conflicts, although we might think that they are something we should run away from or not engage, they really are opportunities, and they can be used constructively as learning opportunities to promote peace. And the opportunity for dialogue about conflictual perspectives increases people's interest and engagement in various topics. For young people, this is incredibly important because the presence of conflict around relevant topics leads to greater engagement. So in these contexts, students could actually, in schools, they could practice the kinds of constructive communication skills, practicing dealing with different types of emotions when engaged in conflict in their classrooms, and expanding that to their lives. So how do we prepare young children for peace? In my research, I observed a religious conflict between two female students who were 9 years old, both 9 years old in grade 4. So pseudonyms are Fatima, who's Muslim, and Tina, who's Christian. And Tina told Fatima that her God was not the real God. Fatima was very upset and burst into tears. She was upset and alone, and she was crying in the hallway. And their teacher, Miss Marley, she heard of the incident and immediately reprimanded the students. She started by lecturing the entire class and telling them that we should all practice acceptance and understanding of other cultures. So Fatima and Tina were both very vocally dominant in their class, but when they were dealt with this very top-down authoritarian lecture, they were silent. So they just chose to self-silence during this incident. And when such incidents occur, it really is challenging to think about how do we best address these situations. And it begs the question of whose responsibility it is to do something. So Miss Marley In this case, she initially chose to shut down the conflict, but what else could she do or should she do? And come back to this analysis in just a moment. So thinking about, what kinds of peace and how we can think about goals for managing conflict to achieve peace, here's a bit of a conceptualization to think about. So peacekeeping is a process of control. It's initially shutting down a conflict from occurring. So an example could be if two students are engaged in a physical altercation, one would obviously immediately use a peacekeeping approach to separate the conflict and separate the two parties in conflict. They might be met with a school suspension as a result, which is still continuing to promote peacekeeping. And then we can move into a place, and some schools choose to do this, of peacemaking, which is non-punitive and may involve mediation, a problem-solving discussion. Maybe those young people apologize to each other or their teacher after they had that fight, and some sort of resolution is met with. And then we could go into a place where is usually a bit tricky, and usually people find it to be messy and uncomfortable. However, it is a place that has the most sustainable options for building peace. So peace building involves interrupting injustice. So thinking about students participating in a restorative peace circle in lieu of suspension or post-suspension. There are some school boards that now require that students participate in a reintegration circle before coming back into the school after they have been suspended. So, there are different ways in which we can think about how we can rebuild healthy relationships and really challenge structural violence that is embedded in the school system. So considering this model and thinking about these different goals for managing peace, we can see that Ms. Marley's actions and her ways in which she chose to address the religious conflict was delivered in a top-down authoritarian manner to end the verbal conflict using peacekeeping overall. So my research is about how we equip teachers with the ability to seize those opportunities to enable the kind of dialogue that allows young people to engage in issues of power and inequity that's associated with their cultural identities connected to race, ethnicity, citizenship status, migration experience overall. And I look at children's experiences of conflict as they are closely connected to their identities and how that forms part of their citizenship learning. So every day there really are countless opportunities. However, they are often missed opportunities to enable authentic critical dialogue. And those opportunities for dialogue really enable the individual to contribute meaningful to social development and cultural inclusion. So the classroom is one of those spaces. However, where the dominant ways of thinking often gets reinforced, and one might wonder, well, how do you reinforce dominant ways of thinking? And it's really because it's embedded in the school curriculum, and when it's delivered in a top-down manner, we run the risk of excluding a large body of our students and their identities. But if we can turn the classroom into a place where we have dialogue about diversity and conflict and address issues of power and difference, we are really creating a space for that important dialogue to occur. And having opportunities for open, inclusive dialogue about conflict supports diverse students in building the kinds of skills and the communication skills they need for democratic civic engagement. So when conflict is taken up constructively, we can see that dialogue ensues. And in this particular religious conflict that I shared in this school, Ms. Marley was in a context where she was really constrained as a teacher, working in a school where high stakes testing was a priority. She was covering an intense amount of curriculum and focused on that. She still, however, decided to step back and try to focus on peace building. And when I was working with her, she decided to try to use a process to try to emphasize peacekeeping with her, to try to think about how she can emphasize peace building with her students. So a few days after this particular incident, she invited her students to come back to the classroom and create creation stories. So she shared an Inuit creation story with the students, and then asked them to go home and speak to their families and do research and prepare a story from their culture's perspective. Tina and Fatima enthusiastically engaged in this exercise. And when the time came for them to present in class, everyone engaged in a shared dialogue. They were respectfully asking each other questions, they were listening attentively, and these efforts at peace building really showed the kinds of learning opportunities that are available to interrupt injustice and provided a sustained foundation to facilitate coexistence amongst the different students in the classroom. And we can see how, from this particular example, of how students could use these opportunities at school to apply it to their understanding of the world around them, where they could see and model people truly listening to one another and hearing one another as well. So if you wanted to read more about this study, I published a book about it, and it focuses on different ways to look at how we can empower conflict and dialogue to increase students' learning opportunities, for those of you that might be interested in reading more about it. So in my research on peace building circles specifically, I found that many instances of increased engagement amongst diverse students occur when teachers make conflict explicit. So this is especially notable when teachers are inviting inclusive conversations about conflict and diversity, and when students' identities and perspectives are taken into account. So restorative pedagogy is a way in which students could actually feel safer to find their voices and play with the fluidity of their identities and social realities. And dialogic pedagogies encourage quieter students to participate because they welcomed more viewpoints and experiences. So bringing constructive conflict dialogue into the classrooms, which is what my current study focuses on, is how we can help teachers facilitate, how we can actually help facilitate teachers' facilitation of conflict talk, and really think about how we can teach teachers and equip them with this kinds of skills and coaching that they need to be able to teach students how to actually implement these skills. So some of this involves using elicitive pedagogies, challenging prescriptive and top-down pedagogies that often silence voices, and drawing on the cultural knowledge of students in the classroom. And oftentimes students expect teachers to respond to a very prescriptive way of conflict, and they often carry many similar expectations and assumptions for student behavior based on their own unconscious or sometimes very conscious biases. And that shows up in the ways in which they address both proactively engaging conflicts as well as post-incident conflicts as well. So training teachers to use alternative methods is challenging, obviously, within the constrained context of schooling, but through professional development and coaching, they might be more inclined or better equipped to introduce particular dialogic tools, such as peace circles. So peace circles, which some of you may know at a very basic level, are when students are really just seated in a circle and facing each other and given the opportunity to talk. So the person with the talking piece has the right and the opportunity to speak if they choose to, and everyone else sitting in the circle has the responsibility to listen. And this format encourages students to listen attentively to each other and also provides everyone with a chance to speak to one another. And you can see in the photo here there, which is an aside from a photo of a circle from the peace education work that we did in Jamaica that was led by Monica, who will be speaking next. So it's really wonderful to think about ways to bring this work together and be in conversation here tonight. So peacemaking circles are a simple yet powerful process that we've appropriated from Indigenous culture, and many organizations and communities use the process in conjunction with the criminal justice system. Specifically, a lot of organizations use circles as an alternative with the youth criminal justice system. So I had the opportunity through some of my work to facilitate some of these circles. And while some youth initially come into the circle thinking that it will be an easier process and easier to go through a circle than to go through the court system, almost always they say that it was a much more challenging process. Challenging because they actually had to speak. They had to speak and they had to listen and they had to hear how their actions impacted others. So rather than having to sit silently behind a box while someone spoke for them in circle, they actually had to hear how their actions impacted another person. And in some cases, in most cases, I would argue, the dialogue in circle not only transforms the outcome of a conflict, but transforms the outcome of the individual as well. And it could be a very transformative experience. In classroom contexts, where teachers are using circles proactively to build community, to do what the literature refers to as teaching both with and for discussion, where we're paying close attention to both the content and the pedagogy, you can see how circles could be used as a tool for facilitating constructive dialogue. And the research on peace circles is clear in terms of its outcomes. Engaging in these particular dialogic methods teach and support people to communicate effectively, to listen attentively, and to facilitate collaborative and safe spaces. So tools that they and skills that they need to be successful in their lives, both within the classroom and beyond the classroom. Still, we can't expect restorative practices and circles to automatically facilitate nonviolence and mutual respect and inclusion as well. And some people might say, well, you know, the circle process is inclusive, and as long as you are seated in circle, it will be an inclusive and equitable process. And that's not always the case. And I think it's important to talk about it in terms of the critiques of circles, as well as the necessary components of preparing young people specifically for building the kinds of relationships that are necessary for transformation. So in one circle that I observed it was in a grade 6 and 7 classroom, the teacher who used the process very sporadically and didn't really build a community around a circle process, but decided to bring her students together in a circle to talk about the topic of bullying, which was a very loaded topic because many of the students had direct experiences with bullying, and there was bullying occurring between the students themselves. So while she engaged this topic, there were 3 male students that consistently spoke. They often spoke over each other, were laughing at each other, and the conversation went towards promoting violent behavior to address bullying. So this example highlights the importance of really carefully training the facilitator and preparing students for the process. In another class with grade 8 students, the teacher had extensive training in using circles and was committed to her ongoing professional development of implementing peacemaking pedagogy. She really focused on building a classroom culture around circle norms. And she showed, when done effectively, circles really did increase the opportunities for quieter students, particularly English language learner students, to participate. So this particular teacher that was using circles as a particular community norm felt it was very beneficial for her very transient student population. So she was in a school where there was a high refugee population, so students were constantly coming into the classroom and leaving the classroom. So the need to build community was a consistent effort. And there was one student who had arrived in her class who didn't speak English and had never spoken in the class at all. And when she brought them together in a circle and this young person received the talking piece, he spoke for the very first time. And immediately all the other students in the class started to clap and acknowledge his voice. So you can really see in particular context where you have that culture of community and relationality built in to the classroom culture, you do really encourage more opportunities for young people to engage and participate. So in another instance for circle dialogue, we can also think about the topic and how the topic could be relevant and engaging. So there are some students who might not feel as though they want to participate and might feel as though they want to exclude themselves and from the process overall. In one class, in another classroom that I observed, there was a student who had recently arrived from Syria, and he chose to exclude himself from the weekly class circle. So although the teacher was very enthused about using the method and had it embedded into her weekly schedule where they would constantly, and students would look forward, many of them would look forward to sitting together in circle, there was a student that chose to sit outside of the circle and didn't take the talking piece, was often on his phone and not wanting to engage. However, the teacher chose to invite all the students in the class to bring topics for discussion and topics to reflect on. And one of his peers brought up the topic of ISIS and chemical weapons in the news. And this particular student decided to share his own experience in that moment and really felt compelled to share what he witnessed firsthand in Syria and what happens to people when they're affected by chemical weapons. So in these particular moments where you see students engaging and having that opportunity to feel included in the classroom, you can see how young people might feel more prepared and safer to dive deeper into dialogue, sharing aspects of their identities, asking questions, and also being prepared to challenge the content that teachers might be presenting. So too often, I think the research on restorative practices and conflict resolution education and peacemaking, it really ignores children's diversities and identities and prescribes what I would consider a one-size-fits-all approach, which ultimately reinforces exclusion and marginalization. And the work in restorative justice in education specifically needs to take a more holistic approach in terms of recognizing and acknowledging our history of racism and oppression. And we need to create spaces for liberation to empower young people to become leaders and social activists themselves. So as part of this particular movement of colorizing restorative justice, which is a book that was recently published, there are chapter contributors, 20 contributors that are all of color, doing work in the restorative justice field, sharing their experiences with the process and from their own lived experience. So in my chapter, which is the third chapter, I talk about how we can really focus on how to model restorative practices and train teachers to use a race-conscious lens. And while anti-racism is usually seen as separate from restorative justice, we really need to see how connected the two are, and that teachers' own sense of their self-efficacy and confidence really does influence the choices they make in the classroom, particularly for their classroom management processes. So if we can equip teachers with the skills and confidence to manage their classroom and build the kinds of relationships with students, you can almost always see that they will be less punitive in instilling oppressive rules and structures, which will ultimately intercept what could be considered the cradle to prison pipeline. So we often hear about the school to prison pipeline, but some also refer to the cradle to prison pipeline, which refers to the structural injustice that produces inequality and racism and discrimination, and it leaves some groups of young people perpetually underserved and thus resulting in incarceration. So the school system is one entry point into this pipeline, and restorative justice and the work that's being done around restorative justice in schools cannot be achieved without addressing differences and working towards challenging oppression. So leaders in the community services professions, such as educators, child and youth workers, social workers, carry the capacity to identify young people who may be veering off of paths that could lead to extremism or social isolation and exclusion. And by working collaboratively and collectively, we really can facilitate redirection for these students. So in classrooms or schools, drop-in centers, young people really should be able to identify trusted adults that could stand up for their well-being and their inclusion. And consistent attention to finding ways to promote restorative pedagogy, to encourage dialogue and dissent, and the examination of difference would allow for greater depths of social inclusion to occur, where we can challenge violence and hate with peace. So above all else, what the research I've done in schools in Toronto,
Friends, I thank you, Nancy, for your introduction. I place gratitude for the opportunity to talk with you tonight for a little while. Words are hardly full enough to illustrate the meaningful of these past few weeks and for the project by the Canadian Friends Service Committee that we've gone through, the only way forward. I am, as was noticed, a member of Toronto Monthly Meeting. And I thought I would mention this again, just simply because to explain that I am a Quaker. I live my life as best I can with those beliefs and practices. And one of the reasons, of course, was because in 1650s, a fellow called George Fox, and we don't think of him as now, but he was radical in his time. And I believe in being radical if one is to change. And his radical thinking was that we are all here and we're all going to, we are all that of God, that of spirit, that of the divine, whatever we want, but we are all here. And so because we all share this commonality of the divine, however we want to describe that, we are therefore here. We're all equal, and we're also here to take care of each other. So that is my underlying principle of why I get to be a Quaker and why I get to still associate with the Canadian Friends Service Committee over a kind of like almost 40-year period. I'm going to try to cut this down because I wanted to leave some time that we can answer some of those questions. So I'm hoping that what I'll do is if I look like I'm breezing through, maybe Nancy and Kara can have people contact me to speak further if that's what the people feel. Quakers have always traditionally been the people, because of the aforementioned idea that we're equal and we are here to care for each other, have always been participating in trying to change what we call the justice system. And we know that the justice system isn't just. I also have, besides hope and imagination, I have the other piece, which I call love and justice. And I think that if that's not our plan, we should almost stop now and admit it, because we can't go forward. There is no way forward unless we recognize that the systems we have at the moment is a punitive one. It is not just. It does not offer the opportunity for people to find their best selves, nor does it offer the opportunity for people to have any redemption. We've learned so much this week. We have learned, not this week, these past weeks. Everybody has shared fully and generously of their thoughts and their ideas and their practices. We've been offered a lot of resources, films, webinars, readings, examples, and study options to study. It's been a period where I've learned a great deal, but I've spent a good deal of the time feeling sad, actually, feeling how come we don't get it? How come as a society we can't understand that what we have now is not, it's not effective for one thing, but it's not acceptable. And so I thought about what needs to happen? What has happened? All our speakers have spoken about what they have done in order to create change in a system that is not working, in order to hand in a part of themselves, a part of their group, a way of going forward. We've had a period of time where we think about the externals. today we're supposed to be emphasizing what needs to change. And how does it happen? We talk about change in the society. We had a list that takes us from the society and works us down to the individual. It's kind of like a triangle balanced on the point of the individual. And I'm thinking to myself, that's not stable. It's top heavy, it's not stable. So I'd like to suggest that our way forward is to flip that and to make ourselves the base. We want to look at ourselves in terms of what is it we can do? I was speaking to Nancy right at the start of this, and I said, you know, we have all these resources. We've listened, we've learned. But I think, let's bring it home, was how I said to Nancy and Kira. Let's bring it home. What does that mean for us? What does that mean if we no longer rely on somebody else telling us how it should be, what it is, and we really don't have any options except to kind of struggle through it, to put all our energies in trying to overturn the harm that the system does. How are we going to participate? How do we respond to a penal system that doesn't really work? And it dawned on me, if we switch our paradigm, what is it that we have? Where does it come from? And it comes back to us. The Oxford Dictionary's description of a shift in paradigm is a major or conceptual methodological change in the theory or practice of a particular science or discipline. It appears to me that way forward has a barrier. It can't go forward because the system we have is broken and flawed. It doesn't really work. So how do we go? Well, the only way forward is change. We have to change the system we are working with. Here's the challenge. Are we going to continue to do what is expected of us? We just say it's going to change, but we continue to do what is expected of us. Where we're putting our energies into protesting what we don't like, while instead of changing it to what we think will work better. Are we going to be able, from our small corner, work at changing the traditional patterns of our society? What are we actually doing? How are we bringing this home in our knowledge and practices, in our families, in our relationships with our coworkers, with our neighbors, with our spiritual and social community? What will we do tomorrow that will make a way forward that we have not done today? So our switch has to be quick, because we see the struggles of not getting it right all over. We see young people being, well, not young people, people being killed because they don't do what society thinks they should do, or the society has given over the correction supposedly to groups that really don't give a toss or haven't learned how to work with people. These questions are significant and challenging, and I understand that. But I believe we can at least start. I believe that we can take the leap of faith and jump. We have for some reason, in all our, we have about 3 bathrooms in our house. We've got tons of reading material. So I always think somebody's escaping to the bathroom to get their reading done because the house is so active. But there was a magazine that I came across that says, it said a big thing, live a gentler life and be kinder. And then it said, restart, repurpose, refresh, read more and relax. Out of all those words, the words that jumped out to me most was restart, repurpose, and refresh. And I think that we have to do that on a personal level in order to bring it home, so that we are taking back the power that we've lost or given up to the society at large that is punitive. I'm thinking that we need to bring it home by starting from ourselves, by looking deliberately, intentionally looking at what we do that really, in fact, continues to nurture the system that's not working. I define myself as a craft person, an artist, and in fact, I work a lot with my hands. I'm a visual person. I'm not a very good print manager. Like, I could never write a thesis, but I could make you a design. And I could find out for you what is in that design that makes into a whole. And I've, over my life, figured out that really, in fact, the world I know works on patterns. Everything we do, our use, comes from an idea, a design, a plan, a model, a string of connections or consciousness that we build into a frame, the framework of how we're living, where we live, what we do. It brings that into a frame. If we look, there's always a pattern. So Kara, if you could throw up my patterns. How people live in the world is by reading patterns. And what we do is, and always, is we look at a pattern, and then Kara will do the other one. And we look at another pattern and the other one. And I did that quickly because, in fact, what we would all have noticed in that pattern is what is in the foreground. What is it we see first? And often that's what we do, is we then start to build our reactions, our responses, and so forth on what we see first. Now, Kara, is it too hard to go back to the first one? I'd like us to spend a little time looking at this. This is actually one of my prints. And I want us to look at the print. Just take a minute to look at the print. Because what we will likely see, first of all, is something that appears like flowers. And what our society does is our society then jumps off and starts to respond to this as flowers. So it's much like our penal system. We figure out there's harm, we identify the harm, and then we plan around the harm. And that was the first thing we would see, is that what we think is harm or a criminal activity. And then we'd respond to that. But I'm going to ask us to take a moment. I'd ask us to take one brief moment and just look at this again and tell me, no, you can't tell me, but envision what else you're seeing. If we look closely, we will likely see things that appear like butterflies or dragonflies. things that appear like whirlwinds, things that appear like they're reaching out to connect, like connectors. We will figure out that we have circles, we have different patterns of the dark and different patterns of the light. And I think that really what we need to do is to learn how to handle patterns. For example, we have in the penal justice system in our society, have nothing unless we are traditional, but really in terms of the whole society. What happens is, for example, a kid shoplifts. The first thing is that kid is treated as if it's a criminal activity. And then what we do as a society, we throw it all the things that we think criminals should happen. We do not have a part of our society that stops and says, what was the story before that child took that, whatever it is that wasn't theirs? And so I'm asking us to think about, what would our penal system look like if we stop to think about who that person was? What happened to them before they actually, as we say, broke the law? How can we as a society, individually, help our larger society to change those rules so that we're asking people to look at people's lives, look at the patterns of their lives, and promote interventions based on that? How would the outcome, let's ask ourselves, how would the outcome have been to be different if someone had taken that young person and found out what was happening in their lives before we locked them up and put them in that penal system? Let's restart. Let's stop. Let's look at the young person. Let's repurpose what our intention is in terms of helping that person to become a more productive person. And let's refresh how our thoughts and our patterns as how that person becomes more integrated in the society. In our society, we have learned that really, if we label and treat, that's what we ought to do. Instead of, we find out, and everybody has said that tonight, we have to find out who we're working with, what can most help, what has been the effect in their lives based on experiences, most of it outside of their control. Before they do that thing, they control what we label as criminal. And somebody always asks me, well, what can I do? Well, you know, we can do something. We can decide to act from ourselves instead of acting for the event. We can go to see our person that is representing us in our elected person. We can go to speak to the people who are working in groups. We can do everything. We can do it. We can make ourselves do it. I'd like us to hold up our hands for a moment, right in front of us. And in front of us, I'm going to ask you to hold your hand together like this. And then, you know, it's going to be back, it's closed. And then what I'm hoping we'll do is we'll start as best we can, if we can, to open our fingers, spread our fingers. We're going to be restarting this whole process and repurposing what we're doing. We're going to see our hands, but we're going to try to look what's behind and to make between those spaces. And we're going to say, that is how we will refresh our thinking and our efforts. What shall we do? We will personally work towards that change. We'll use everything we can to make sure that we see what's behind what it is we're doing now in terms of retribution and punitive behavior. We're going to try to level out so that the background is as important, that our patterns are only a whole if we see what's happening behind as what's happening in front and all the patterns that has made. And we're going to try to change it. We're going to gather up our strength. We're going to grab back our power, and we're going to bring it home to ourselves. And then we're going to say to our best selves, how can we make that change? I'm just going to end by saying, you know, as a Quaker, there is always an understanding that one small drop makes a difference. Rufus Jones, which is a well-known Quaker, in 1937 was asked to lead a world justice group meeting amongst Quakers. And in it, he said this: in regards to the World Conference, I sincerely hope for good results. But I have become a good deal disillusioned over big conferences and large gatherings. I pin my hopes to quiet processes and small circles in which vital and transforming events take place. And I'm going to ask us to take all this event as the small circles, to look at our lives as to the small circles, and to think of when a drop falls into a lake and the ripples of the effects of the small circles, and to think of ourselves as doing what we can do, which is to shifting, which is to put our influence in so that vital and transforming events can take place. I thank you very much. And this is obviously a long topic, but I hope that some of your questions, Nancy, will help us.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you so much. If I could ask all the panel members to turn their videos on and their sound on, that would be great. So I'm just looking at the time. I think I have one question. We have several actually that were submitted beforehand, but I'm going to leave those because I see that we do have some in the Q&A box, but I have one that I really want to ask Sara. Sara,
I can't get my video on, Nancy.
Oh,
Sorry.
oh, darn. Okay. Is there any way that we can help you with that, Kira, or no? I don't know how that works.
Let me
I
work
think it
on
was-
it if you want to start.
Okay. So Sara, my question for you, because you can hear, right?
Yeah, I think my video was turned off by the host because I accidentally forgot to.
Kira.
There we go.
Oh, there you are. Okay, great. Good to
Thank
see
you.
your face again. So my question for you was, you had said at one point when you were presenting that, and it was in reference to you did the work yourself, you decided you were going to do it. And then you said, but that put a target on me. Can you talk a little bit more about what you meant by that?
Absolutely. So in trying to access services to try and better myself, like mental health, I have a lot of past trauma. So one thing I knew that I needed for myself is to break the cycle. I had to address those traumatic issues that I have grown up dealing with, well, not dealing with. So in order to do that, I wanted to access mental health services. Unfortunately, while in the federal institutions, that isn't necessarily something that's offered. It's offered to some people, but not everybody. You're deemed low needs when you go through triage, unless you're self-harming or suicidal at the time. It's very difficult to get in there. And then when you do, they refuse to offer any trauma-informed therapy because they don't believe that opening that doorway and then sending you back to your room without proper follow-up is beneficial. However, being in the federal prison, you are traumatized while you're in there. So how's it any different? And one example of that, and I'll say it because it's out there, is there was a guard inside the institution I was in that was sexually assaulting women. And I was one of those victims. And when I asked for help with that, they said, "What do you need from us?" I said, "I want access to the sexual assault center out in the community." Now, the whole point of these women's federal institutions that came about after P4W, and they moved to the locations across Canada in the 5 locations on the Healing Lodge, is that it would be there to access community resources. But it took me, I was in for 5 years, and not once did I get to go out and access one of those resources. And I fought and fought and fought. And that's exactly what I'm talking about. You can't access any resources that are there to help you change your life. You might know what you need, you might have that insight, you might want to make the changes, but they'd rather keep you in there, have you victimized and traumatized all over again, and deny you any access because they don't want the world to know what's going on in there. And that's what I meant by, and then that target's on my back. Plus, I was an advocate working for CAFES, for Canadian Association of Elizabeth Fry Society, while on the inside. So here I was fighting for human rights, fighting for justice, and fighting for compliance of policies and whatnot. And so that put a huge target on my back as well, because heaven forbid somebody would be in there fighting for the rights of others or for themselves. They don't want you to have a voice. If you have a voice, that makes you dangerous. Yeah. So the 5 years that I was in there, I spent the entire time fighting just to be able to make the changes I knew I needed to make, so I wouldn't go back into the system. And that's what I mean by prisons are not a place for rehabilitative measures or reform. It's not a place to heal. It's not a place to get help. It's a place to discriminate. You look, the majority of the people incarcerated in the federal system, or even the provincial system, are Indigenous or Black. And, that discrimination is carried on inside. Fighting for simple things like hygiene products for people who, like, African descent. I had to fight for people incarcerated in the system just to get their hair products. They don't care about cultural diversity. They don't care about holistic measures. They're there to be punitive. They're there to oppress. They're there to control. And I'll tell you, there is such a mass abuse of power and control in those places. And they all work together to cover it up. And it's people like me that are dangerous to them. And that puts a target on my back. But every time I had them fighting against me, and every time they do things to, throw me in segregation, throw me in maximum security, take away my rights, punish me, institutionally charge me, it just made me realize that I was doing my job and I was doing it well. Because the more they threw at me, the harder I fought. And I continued to be a voice for those who didn't have one.
Wow, Sara, thank you for sharing that. Wow, thank God for you. Thank you. I'm going to go to the Q&A section. The first it's another one for Sara. So you're Sara, this is from Yaz, who is actually also a member of the advisory committee and was one of our speakers at the first panel. So Yaz is asking, Sara, great discussion. You really showed the power that people who have been involved in the justice system have. There is strength in doing something about your situation. How do you feel about programs that look specifically at the charge in a strength-based way, for example? For example, stealing cars. might be an amazing mechanic, and giving them the tools instead of punishing them?
Thanks, Yaz, for the question and for your kind words. I think that training should be available in a wide variety of areas. I mean, and as it is right now, they don't even offer post-secondary education. You're allowed to get your GED. It used to be that you can access college and university. You can't even do that now. They do offer very minimal training, like first aid, forklift, things like that, but nothing that would be trades training, nothing that would be any skills training to help you when you get back into the community. And as for the example of like someone who steals cars, train them to be a mechanic, they might be a good mechanic. I like to think that working on the person and figuring out who they are is what's more important, because until they find their passion, a lot of times stealing cars isn't about, you know, something that they might be good at. It's about a means to get what they need. So I think it's about, like me, I have so many different educational backgrounds. I got my small engine, my millwright, my plumbing gas fitting, my journeyman, my international business, my CIP designation, and now I'm going to get my law degree. And the reason why is because it took me all those years going through all these different things that I enjoyed doing and I thought was my calling. But until I figured out myself who I was, what I wanted out of life, and what I wanted to do to move forward, that's when I found my passion. And that's when I knew it was in law. And so I think it's all about figuring out who the person is, allowing them to become their own, and going from there and finding their passion and providing that kind of training and skills.
I think you're going to be an amazing lawyer.
Thank you.
The next question is for Christina, again from Yaz, who's been very active tonight typing in here. Christina, according to the Toronto Star, Black and Aboriginal students are 3 times more likely to get suspended than when they only make up 12% of the population, or they make up 12% of the population in schools in Toronto compared to white students. What can we do to change this disproportionate number?
Yeah, thanks so much for that question. Yes, I really enjoyed your presentation a few weeks ago as well. And yeah, your question is incredibly valid and true. And you know, not only are they most likely to be Black and Indigenous students more likely to be suspended. There's also studies that show they're more likely to be suspended for more subjective infractions, such as like being disrespectful, in contrast to more objective infractions that their white peers would be subject to, such as being late. So there's much more room for bias. So, you know, just to answer very quickly, thinking about anti-racist training, that is not a one-day required professional development, but that's something ongoing that is consistent and happening, infiltrated into the school system on a consistent basis. So that's just a quick response so that we can get more voices. But thanks so much for your question.
Thank you, Christina. Jennifer, this is a question for you, again from Yaz. Jennifer, I think it's amazing what you said about oneself. Oh, I've always said to myself, have you ever lived my life, walked in my shoes? Then why would you ever judge me the way you do or the way you did? Do you think it's important if political people in power go into the communities, know how much welfare really is, see how schools actually are, walk through the shoes of these racialized communities? How can they help if they don't even know how much food costs? Picking up whatever they want is a privilege alone.
Thanks, Yas, for that great question. I think I would start with saying I actually think that politicians should come from those communities. And I think one of the problems that we're having in policy development and positions of power is that there's not enough people that actually represent the communities that they're seeking to serve. And so I would love to see a Yaz in a political space one day. Having those opportunities, I think, change the discourse, and it changes how folks understand. But in lieu of that, and if that is not something that's going to happen, then it is, I think, essential that politicians are aware of the communities that they serve, and so are in those spaces consistently speaking with and on behalf of those communities, and really creating community with those folks so that there's awareness, because I don't think you can serve folks that you don't know. So I think that's my quick answer, but I'm a proponent of representation that's meaningful. And so having folks who are part of these communities in government making policy, I think would be profoundly a profound shift in the way politics happens.
Thank you. I think the question from Jan is for you, Christina, because it's speaking about restorative education. And it sounds like, Jan, you're interested in knowing how you can access more information about the book as well, and wanting restorative justice in schools where you are, I guess, in Salt Spring Island, lucky you, in British Columbia. I know that you put your email, I don't know if it was an email or a website, at the end of your PowerPoint. Certainly, Kira is going to be sending out surveys and emails to everybody that's here tonight, and we can certainly include that if that answers your question. And you have no way of really telling me, except in chat, I guess, that answered your question. And I don't know, Christina, if you wanted to add more to that. I'm not letting you speak at all, I realize, as I'm going on.
Totally
I'm sorry.
Yeah, Jen, I'd be happy to chat more. So yeah, I'd love to hear from you. So thank you.
So I'm looking at the time. We did well, actually. We did incredibly well tonight. Thank you so much for all of you for keeping within the time and for your valuable, insightful, heartfelt presentations. It was just wonderful. I wish we had more time. I have all these other questions I want to ask, but this is not over. So it's not the end of the work that we've started. I agree with Monica on that. We've had queries about what happens next. Many of you are looking, I think, for concrete and actionable steps. We hope you will continue on this journey with us, and who knows where it will lead. We will be sending out more information and invitations to meet again, most likely in early January 2021. But in the meantime, we have a treat for December. We have an exclusive documentary screening planned for Monday, December 14th, 7 p.m. Eastern Time. This will be the first time this film, which is called A Second Chance, and it's by Rex Blumstein and Justin Temple. It's the first time it's being released outside of the United Kingdom. We have permission from the filmmakers to show the film only to our Only Way Forward project group, and by private invitation only. I've seen the trailer, and we'll send out the trailer as we get closer to the time. It looks fantastic. The film actually documents the importance of a second chance through employment. I mean, we saw some of it tonight through art and artwork at the beginning in the slideshow. Here's a different spin, and uses employment as a vehicle within the institution. It's really, really interesting. And it tells the story. Some of them are heartbreaking, some are uplifting, of those incarcerated trying to transform their lives using this employment tool. So I hope you'll join us for what I think would be a really interesting and engaging event. Stay tuned for emails from Kira. We're also going to keep the Only Way Forward Facebook page live for now and continue posting. And I encourage all of you to keep posting and comment freely. Let's keep that alive. And Kira, just again, thank you to the speakers for taking the time and for giving such insightful presentations, giving us so much to think about, especially in terms of moving forward. Monica, I think we have to take what you said in terms of bringing it home and how we do that going into January. And we will be contacting the advisory group again. Some of you are in the audience, and we have Jen and Monica here too. So we don't want to lose you and lose your influence yet. Thanks to all of you, and have a good evening.